Kelly and Michelle Almer had joined the other call. I just redirected them here. They should be joining shortly.
Okay. So we'll need one more then to be in quorum. Once they join, right? We need 6.
Yeah,
Is Mark going to be able to join?
no, I don't know if you accepted or not.
I think
but-
he was planning on it.
Hi, Kelly. Roger's joining.
This is Michelle.
Hi, Michelle. Looks like we're good. I'll go ahead and call this meeting of the Rules Task Force together for the Arizona State Board of Pharmacy. Today is October 30th. The time is 11 a.m. Dr. Gandhi, if you could do roll call, please.
Certainly, Madam Chair. Ms. Walmsley,
Here.
Ms. Nair,
Here.
Mr. Dang, Mr. Pond,
I'm here.
Ms. Howe, Ms. Fine, Kelly,
I see her name and she raised
I
her
see.
hand.
Yep, she raised her hand. Mr. Bozen, Mr. Morris,
Here.
right? Ms. Sutcliffe is on PTO. Ms. Davis,
Present.
Ms. Ulmer. Okay, it looks like, let me get on the other one again. This looks like Mark Bozen and Emily joined the other one. I'll redirect them. Give me a second.
Okay, sounds good. While we're waiting for Dr. Gandhi, does anyone have any conflicts they'd like to disclose for the meeting?
Do you want us to each tell you none, or just silence is our
Silent,
answer?
silence
Okay.
is golden.
Okay.
For the record, I think Ms. Howe and Mr. Bozen are also connected. If you could please confirm that you can hear us.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
Here.
Awesome. Any conflicts from anybody before we proceed? It looks like we're in quorum.
We are,
Right.
Madam Chair. We also have Beena Patel that's joining. She's from Honor Health and she's got a lot of hospital experience.
Awesome. Welcome to the task force.
She was on the other link. I just redirected her, so hopefully she'll join while we're talking.
All right. Well, Dr. Gandhi, I don't know if you want to go ahead and pull up we've got draft language, or if we want to just start with the general discussion on the USP standards.
I think general discussion would be a good place to start. I don't have anything drafted because we have something in our rules already about good current good compounding practices. And we may want to tackle that agenda item. And then, of course, the definition of current compendium. Let me bring that up here real quick.
Maybe Mark could give us an overview of what he brought before the board.
I could if the chair would like me to.
Yeah, if you think it'd be helpful to kick off the discussion, Mark, if there's a couple pieces that you think would be helpful.
Well, a couple things. One is our 423, 410, our good compounding practices are old. They predate the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013. They still reference the ability to do things like office use compounding, which the board hasn't allowed since the enforcement of the Drug Quality and Security Act. And so generally, our 423, 410 needs some updating at a minimum. Now, when it comes to dealing with USP, the USP chapters, whether they be 795, 797, or 800, or any other chapter for that matter, one of the things Arizona administrative law requires us to do is reference a specific publication and publication date. And but even if we did that, there are still some significant problems with the lack of discretion by the compounding pharmacist in the new chapters, particularly as it relates to beyond use dating and components to be used in a compound. And it was the sense of the Pharmacy Association when I presented over the summer was that there are different risk categories for pharmacies. They're lost in the new chapters. It treats everyone the same. It treats all hazardous materials the same. And that's just not true. And so it would be the request of the Pharmacy Association and the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding and the Independent Pharmacists Coalition that as we look at chapter or Rule 410, that we take into consideration risk categories. There is a difference, for example, when compounding fluconazole for valley fever for a canine versus an anti-neoplastic or something that is clearly more dangerous and presents a more significant hazard both to the patient and the compounder. And so with that, it would be prudent, in my opinion, for this committee to consider which portions of USP 795, 797, and 800 ought to be applicable and non-negotiable in Arizona pharmacies, and which ones that pharmacists and technicians ought to be able to build a system that's based upon a risk analysis of the compounds that they make, the facilities that they have available to them, and other factors.
Madam Chair, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
So I have a question. Do you have proposed language that you think would be appropriate?
I don't, but I'd be happy to draft some and bring it back to this committee.
Mark, Madam Chair, if I may, Mark, you had obviously challenged USP when they opened it up, and then they delayed the whole process once again to review everything. Were everything that you just mentioned addressed with USP? Or mentioned to USP?
Was it addressed post-appeal?
I think you appealed it, and that's why there was a delay, wasn't there?
Sure. So a little bit of history. These chapters have been in a revision status for many years. In 2020, our law firm, along with two others, went to Silver Spring to appeal the chapters, requesting more leniency, particularly with beyond use dating, arguing that this is going to be cost prohibitive to the patients, and decrease access to vital compounded medications. And that tribunal agreed in part and said, go back to the expert committee and make some changes. In my opinion, there were no substantial changes that were made. A new expert committee was impaneled. There weren't any substantial changes. And so now we're back with the same arguments we were making in 2020.
Mark, I fundamentally agree with what you're saying. To me, one of the biggest changes with 795 was that they removed the different categories of compounding. Before there were different types of compounding, simple compounding, moderate compounding, I think, and complex compounding were the three different definitions. And I think that to me is one of the biggest challenges, right? So to me, to your point, it's very different to think about compounding fluconazole from bulk powder into capsules versus making a miracle mouthwash, or even making Tamiflu suspension when it goes on back order in a community pharmacy every single year. There's varying different degrees of compounding. And I don't know if we want to look at that necessarily as a committee, but I do think that some of the changes that are required from a facility standpoint and a training standpoint are going to create a lot of challenges for those individuals that aren't really like specialty type compounding pharmacies, where there could be a reduction in access for sure for the public. That is something that I feel very passionate about.
Would it be possible, Mark, or anyone else, to use the NIOSH list as some sort of parameter setting for compounders with as far as USP 800? So if someone is making anything on NIOSH 1 list, which is typically just the anti-neoplastics, then full enforcement of 800 would be required. But pharmacies making things with just, say, a reproductive risk would obviously have some sort of protections in place for their staff without having to go all the way to what USP 800 requires.
I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. NIOSH does give us different categories. It's unfortunate that USP didn't seem to differentiate between those categories in the implementation of their chapters. And that's where the complication occurs here. And I think that's a reasonable place to look at a potential solution, at least for 800.
For 800. And then for 795, like what Lori was talking about, perhaps there would be a way to make some sort of formulary of simple compounds and, I don't know, formulations or recipes for them, that as long as it's compounded within these parameters using these ingredients, then it's outside of the bounds of USP 795. I don't know what we're allowed to do as far as a board with rulemaking, like if we can adopt 795 except for.
I think a lot of it could come down to the definition of compounding. So there's a handful of states that have looked at allowing a certain number of ingredients, as long as they weren't from bulk powders, to be compounded. I think Mississippi is an example where it would allow for, like, for example, magic mouthwash kind of stuff to be prepared, or making, butt paste, that kind of stuff as exempted from like the full compounding regulations. Obviously, there are still certain things that need to exist, but you wouldn't necessarily need to meet the higher physical facility standards, or some of those kinds of things, or the additional training standards that would be required. The challenge I think that we have, and Mark, maybe you or Roger could give some suggestions here, is I believe the reference to 795 and 800 is in statute. So I think part of this in parallel, we may need to consider a bill for the session to address some of those concerns. And I'm not sure, am I correct in that, saying that, Mark?
I can go look at the statute. Well, here, you got the statute.
I think it's in statute.
think the statute really just defines official compendium. And I think in rule, we should, and we could adopt the official compendium on a certain date. Good compounding practices isn't rule, and we can dissect that out, repeal whatever sections we need, and then update that. One of the things I wanted to draw to your attention is the FDA has 503A defined. And I believe they do say standards of applicable USP. So you got to be compliant according to FDA. I've been in talks with FDA, Mark. I don't know if you have, but they're looking at it from the current version of USP. I know you've brought something to our board as far as when that was enacted and stuff like that, but I don't think FDA sees it that way today. So I don't know if you want to take on that challenge with the FDA or not, but that's going to be a challenge.
Well, this has always been a fight with the FDA. The FDA has inappropriately delegated its authority to the USP. The USP is not a government organization. There are no appointees by any government entity. None of those people are elected. There's no due process. We've always argued, and I think we argued successfully in 2020 that there was an improper delegation of authority from the FDA to the United States Pharmacopoeia, and the FDA has a profound responsibility in its rulemaking to make it clear and put it through the administrative procedures process, including open for comments and things like that. And I would also argue that the section of 503A that talks about pharmacy compounding, that references the USP chapters on pharmacy compounding, isn't specific enough. Not even the USP considers its chapters above 1,000 to be "quote unquote" enforceable. But there are a number of chapters above the number 1,000 that involve compounding, which makes it almost illusory. And so that's why I think the states have a profound responsibility, this one included, to make it very specific. What are we going to allow in this state? Under what standards? And I think it will serve us well if we work very deliberately on this to come up with something that balances exactly what we've been talking about, exactly what Lori's talking about. There are compounds that for 200 years, we've made safely. They've never posed a danger to the staff or to the patients. And they're vitally necessary to have widely available within our communities, regardless of what kind of pharmacy you have, whether it's a traditional chain drug community pharmacy or a more sophisticated independent pharmacy that specializes on compoundings. The trick is you can't treat them all the same because you're going to end up making it unaffordable and take away access to compounded medications. And so, even the federal government in its rulemaking needs to identify which chapters it's talking about and not just say anything that's published in the USP or an ANF is fair game, because it's just not, because the USP's book isn't even chaptered like that. They don't consider all of their book to be something that has to be done all the time.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that USP failed to demonstrate, at least in my opinion, was the need for the changes to the chapters. There wasn't, as long as pharmacies were properly following the USP standards set in 2014 and 2007, there wasn't a need for any sort of changes. The pharmacies that did compound medications that harmed people weren't following USP as written. So I don't think USP demonstrated a need for an update to the chapters.
And I think that was one of the most compelling pieces of evidence we presented, was when we asked the FDA and the CDC at the USP appeal, what was the issue we were trying to solve? What was the specific problem that these chapters would now address? And they didn't have any epidemiologic or case studies to cite that there are things happening today that wouldn't happen in the future that are harming patients.
The challenge, Mark, though, is I think you said in your not introduction, but just recently about compounding that's happening within this state, right? Obviously, if it crosses our Arizona borders, it becomes not only our jurisdiction, sort of, but it also becomes jurisdiction of the federal government and the other state that it's going into. How do you propose we?
Well, I would argue the FDA's jurisdiction is limited to the finished compounds. By definition, the practice of pharmacy is exclusively the regulation of the state.
Yes, but by crossing the border, it becomes a federal jurisdiction, and it's a finished compound.
The finished product is the FDA doesn't all of a sudden have jurisdiction over the practice of pharmacy once it crosses state lines. They'll have jurisdiction over whether or not products are adulterated or contaminated once they cross state lines. But the FDA has no jurisdiction over professional practice standard issues. There's no FDA license in my pharmacy. Never has been.
If pharmacies choose to hold non-resident permits in other states, they'd be bound to follow the rules of the states in which they're shipping into, which is outside of Arizona's jurisdiction.
I'd argue you follow both rules. If Arizona requires certain things, those have to be done. If the state where the patient is located requires certain things, those need to be done too.
Yes.
I'd be happy going back to the beginning of taking a stab at some language that people could react to.
I think that may be best. Swamsley is, I didn't know, I'm not the expert in compounding, obviously, and that's why we have Tennille, Mark, and those guys that could probably take a stab at the language better than I could propose. But yeah, my concern obviously is if a federal code does reference 503A and outlines the requirements of it, and it does mention USP. In my discussions with them is that they have to be with the FDA they have to be current on the chapters of USP.
Yeah, I think that's just a fundamental disagreement.
Do we have any blueprint from other states that we know that are not adopting the changed chapters? Because I know, like, for example, Texas is not adopting the updates to 795, 797, and 8.
Yeah, Oklahoma's not. There's a handful of states. I don't know that I have a good summary of exactly who those are, but there are a handful of states that aren't.
I can tell you NABP is working on a list. I've requested it about a month ago. They don't have one as of yet, but hopefully they'll put one together to share. But I have requested it.
So Mark, you're willing to take a stab at it. How much time do you think you need to bring something back to the group?
Just to clarify expectations, I would look at R423, 410 and try to modernize that section to reflect both current rules and current law, current implementation, and a preferred mechanism to move forward with what I'm calling low risk compounding activities, by both trying to define those and set parameters around those. And if I had, say, a couple more weeks, I could probably do some damage.
So early December, maybe we could schedule another one. Is that plenty of time?
That would be wonderful.
Like maybe after the next board meeting, we can look at another date, get through the next board meeting, Cam, before Christmas, in between.
I will do that. Also, Mark, if you can incorporate flavoring, because obviously we have a substantive policy on that and would like to get rid of that.
Okay.
Yeah, again, I'd like to try and retain that if possible, just because I think we'll lose access if we make it be compounding, because we'll have to have prescriptions for it.
Okay.
Does that sound good to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Cam, are we ready to move on to the next topic?
I think so. I think so.
Or, all right, so controlled substance transfer on initial fills. This is because the DEA has updated their language. Cam, is this your proposed language here?
No, nothing's proposed, but I was going to, I mean, it should be a simple fix as to allowing transfer of an original controlled substance prescription pursuant to, obviously the technology being available. Today it's not available. So I can easily wordsmith that one, to include that. If you're okay with it, I can take a quick stab at that. I'll take that as my homework and then present it to next meeting, but, was there anything more complex to what I'm thinking? We have Mark and Roger on the line.
One of the things that I worry about is, and I don't know if you've read about this this resource out there called RX Transfer. They're advertising that they are compliant with the DEA rules and have actually shared, at least in an open forum, a letter from the DEA saying the DEA won't certify as EPCS a transfer only portal. And I worry a little bit about will we ever get to the technology? And should we define what that technology is?
It's my understanding that the NCPDP standards aren't entirely built for this yet. And I think obviously the DEA has requirements about what has to be maintained the digital signature in order for it to be considered a valid hard copy. But I don't know that there is a vendor today that is truly compliant, at least not that I'm aware of. So I think it's important that there is something that says once the service is available or whatever or meets the security standards as required by the DEA, something to that degree.
Correct.
What's the last word on the page? Just says pre. Just curious. Oh, thank you. I figured.
Is there anything else that may need to be? Yeah, Roger.
Didn't we do something previously when we thought there was going to be legislation or changes for biosimilars? That we put some laws in effect in anticipation of those federal changes?
Yeah, we did. Biosimilars basically says once it shows up on the FDA biosimilar list of some sort, then it's allowed. So it was a pretty broad statement.
But I'm just wondering if we can do something like that here. Once it's allowed by the DEA and the technology exists, it's allowed in compliance with the DEA.
Yeah, I mean, pursuant to the technology being available, approved by DEA, absolutely. And we have their language that they have, kind of put out already, so we can kind of recite that in our sections. I didn't draft it yet because I didn't know what I wanted to capture fully. And if you guys had any additional thoughts before I did that.
Makes sense to me, Cam. Anything else from the rest of the group?
No,
Okay, I will start working on that section.
All right, next up is opioid antagonists. Cam, I think you had draft for this, yes?
We have statutory draft, which we're trying to get a legislative sponsor for to support that. I've reached out to a couple of folks in the Senate and the House. Hopefully have a meeting soon. But obviously naloxone right now, we want it in everybody's hands. We still have a opioid epidemic issue across the country. And they do have over-the-counter naloxone available and out for distribution. Some of the roadblocks we have, and I believe the board addressed this at the last meeting and gave us authority to move forward, is reporting into the PMP. Now, obviously, if the pharmacist just hands out a naloxone that's marked over the counter by the FDA, then that's called selling a naloxone, not dispensing a naloxone. And that won't fall under that jurisdiction. But we also know naloxone is going to be somewhere in a price range of $40, $50 or something like that, which some folks may not be able to afford. Access will probably end up paying for it. But once it goes through a pharmacy system a certain way, then it falls under a definition of dispensing. And then now we have that hurdle into reporting into the PMP. So instead of having redundant language of the opioid antagonist, we're obviously going to rework our language in the statutes this legislative session. But I would redline a lot of the naloxone opioid antagonist language in our rule section because it is sort of redundant. Thoughts on that, guys?
I'm glad to see it not being reported. It's not necessary anymore, I don't think.
Yeah. Do you guys understand the backstory of why it became a reporting situation?
Not sure. I remember.
So there was a point when I think 2017-ish time period, the opioids just exploded across the country. And DHS wanted, obviously we opened up an avenue to get naloxone out there in everybody's hands. But DHS wanted to see numbers, right? How many pharmacies are actually distributing and stuff. This was not going to be public information where if I got naloxone, it wasn't going to show up on my PMP report that pharmacists and doctors can see. But behind the scenes, we have numbers on how many were dispensed just for the purposes of DHS and their reporting requirements at that time. It's not as important today for them to have those numbers. So we're all in this together. Unfortunately, discussions started happening sometime in April when legislative session was kind of winding down. No new bills were introduced or anything of that nature. So by that time, we kind of missed the boat in repealing that section. So we are now waiting for this next legislative session. So we have access that's supporting it, DHS supporting it, and any associations and groups we're talking to is supporting the removal of that barrier. So again, in my viewpoint, and correct me if I'm wrong, this should be an easy fix as far as rules go. If we're repealing it from statute.
But the critical first piece is we have to get the statute passed.
Correct. Well, again, Roger, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. If we repeal anything that references reporting the PMP out of rules, it's still in statute, so the states would still, we could probably repeal it out of here because to me, it's redundant language anyway, somewhere in here. And the statute will always be the statute. So we can still move forward with repealing it in our time frame out of the rules. If there's any reference.
Correct.
Then I don't know if we need a vote, but I would be in favor of that. So that way we can, as soon as the statute passes to remove it, that there's not a barrier.
Yeah, and I'll work the rule section, see if there's any reference to it and remove that ahead of time, so that, because once statute passes, I'm hoping to expedite it, but I understand there's some rules on needing to expedite a legislative bill. We don't want to wait till that finalizes before moving in this direction, because then that burden just carries on. Might as well remove it, any reference to it in rules while we have that opportunity today.
I agree, and I think it shows the legislature too, the direction that the board would like to go with this in support of the opioid epidemic.
Okay, so I'll take that on as well.
Any concerns from the group with moving forward with that as a recommendation?
Just see head nods, no shakes, so that's good.
Or
Madam Chair, last thing on the list here, and it was time permitted, it looks like we have a lot of time to discuss this, is the Drug Supply Chain Securities Act. Obviously, it's delayed by another year because of some logistical concerns FDA has brought. Roger, you and I have discussed some of these business models that have continued to evolve. And that needs to be incorporated into this thought process and how to capture everything. NABP has or is creating a platform to capture all this stuff so that pharmacies have the most relevant information how where the drug was incepted, the inception of the drug, and of course the final dispensation of it. So they'll have a track and trace database. I know we had repealed some time ago the pedigree law, because pedigree was an old term not used anymore and so forth. But we do need to look at how to incorporate the Drug Supply Chain Securities Act that the FDA has in place to avoid adulterated counterfeit products being entered into the supply chain. Mark, Roger, I don't 100% recall the pedigree law that was in place that we repealed. You guys recall any of that language at all, or?
I mean, generally, yeah, but why?
We could maybe just reopen that repeal law up and then modify it so that we don't have to try to reinvent the wheel.
What I'm just trying to figure out, Cam, is what are we trying to do with rules? I mean, DSCSA is going to be out there. People are going to have to comply with it. We're going to want to say that a product to be sold in a pharmacy has to be received in compliance with DSCSA, something like that, or are we trying to get more detailed?
The challenge is it is stated in the federal code, and then it'd be a challenge for us to enforce it. It would have to be the FDA that finds them in violation of that law before we can act, unless we itemize it in our rules. Then we can say you're in violation of not only the federal code but the state rules, and so we can obviously bring them to the board or open a complaint, whatever it is. My concern is if it's only in the federal code, then the FDA would have to find that they're in violation first before we may be able to take action on it.
But boy, it's a huge federal law. I'm just trying to think when we don't want to replicate it.
No, not replicate it, but somehow reference it where we then have the authority to exercise our authority.
I don't know, thoughts on how we would accomplish that? Is that a recommendation? Like, how does the committee feel about that? Or task force feel about that?
This is Mark. It is a huge federal law and one that has so much upstream compliance necessary that still isn't quite there yet. I don't know how you would abbreviate it.
Well, we may not have to reinvent the wheel. Other states may have already done it, you know, so I can actually tap some folks on the shoulder to see what they have and modify it to our needs. But is my argument valid, Roger, Mark, as to if it's in a federal code and not really cited in our statutes and rules? Do the federal government have to see that that's a violation before we can act?
I don't know if it has to see it as a violation, but I understand the point.
Mark, it looks like this is giving you a headache. At least from your body language.
Yes, CSA always gives me a headache. The purpose of DSCSA is to prevent counterfeit drug from getting into the system.
Correct.
The delay is related to sort of the final phase and the trading partners, which includes the pharmacies, that say that you've got to have an electronic way to track the drug components that are subject to the DSCSA down to the unit level. I mean, could the regulation be as simple as upon implementation of whatever applicable sections of the CFR apply, Arizona pharmacies shall be required to comply. And then the inspectors then have the ability to check electronic, I'll call it pedigree for lack of a better word, electronic pedigrees, and make sure that everything in the pharmacy has a serial number and everything it's supposed to have on it.
Maybe as simple as that, yeah. It doesn't have to be that extensive. I don't think we have to take it verbatim, but just giving us the authority to review that will eliminate some problems.
Well, let's look at that, and then let's look at what other states are doing, because you're right, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Every state's in the same place.
Correct.
Yeah, I like that suggestion. Is that something you could request from NABP too, Cam,
Absolutely.
for the next meeting?
Yep, I know. This is a tough subject across the country, so I will definitely leverage NABP, but I don't know what they have currently. So, but
And I think this is the topic on the interactive member forum that you and I are
Yeah.
both going to too. So maybe we can take a pulse of the group on how states are intending to handle that too, if they're going to do it in regulation. I don't really, there's no states that I follow that I can recall like a very like extensive rule discussion on this. Just it's been mostly around the delay.
yeah, I think it's it's very confusing. I think they're waiting. They're looking for the first state to do something before they. So which state is going to do something first? I know.
I think I would prefer not to be first on this for sure.
Yeah, but at least we have the discussion, and it's a rule, so it can always be modified quickly. Well, quickly as far as state government goes, but at least we start the discussion. Any other thoughts?
I cannot believe we've covered our agenda in 43 minutes. Is there anything anybody would want to revisit? Anything more on the compounding discussion?
We delegated everything. That's why.
Yeah, next one's gonna take a little longer, I think.
Should we look at potential times for the group for while we've got everybody on the line, Cam, since we've got extra time?
Absolutely. Let me pull up my calendar and see.
See if we can just get it on the books now.
And I'm gonna tell you, it's really hard to coordinate with a lot of leaders on a call. At one point, I think I told Lori, just give me a couple of dates, Lori, and we'll just force it down down the channel.
I know I'm not any easier than anybody else. I apologize.
Yeah, but you being board chair can dictate some stuff. All right, let's see what we have here.
We're looking at the second week of December, the week of the 11th.
Yeah, it's gonna have to be that time period.
The 12th is really open for me. The 12th or 13th are good days for me. I don't know about anybody else.
I like the 12th.
12th in the morning or 13th in the morning?
All right, I'll take a look at it from my personal calendar. I'm not sure if I'm on PTO that week, but I may be able to move it around. My son signed up for the Orange Bowl in Florida. I think it's that week. But we'll see.
Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah.
How about the next week? The next week there's not a ton of meetings either. If that week's a challenge for you, Cam, it's the week before Christmas.
Well, let's pick 2 days, maybe so the 12th is an option. Let me check
Okay.
my personal, and then the week after, anybody have anything available?
The 20th and 22nd look really good for me.
If we
For
did
the
the
morning or
12th,
the 21st.
if we did the 12th, would it be at the same time? Because this time period works for me.
Thoughts, guys? 11 o'clock?
That works for me.
Yeah.
And then either 12th or the 20th?
How's the 20th look for everybody?
I could do before 12:30.
Works for me.
Those work for me too.
So maybe 10 o'clock on that day? Because we'll probably need some time. Is that too soon?
Sure.
Kristen?
That'd be fun.
Okay, so let me check on those 2 dates. At least I'll send a placeholder out, so you guys have it on your calendars.
Great.
And then I'll
Maybe
show-
block both of them and then we can follow it. Just cancel one, Kim.
Yep, I can do that.
And maybe 3 hours since we'll have maybe 3 hours since we'll have like language to actually react to, and that'll probably be a lot more discussion.
Sounds
Mhm.
good. Now, guys, I'll send a placeholder out using my email, but as we get kind of closer, I'll have Crystal send out a Zoom soon after that. But I'd like to get it on your calendar so it's blocked off.
Thank you, Kim.
And if we're talking about the USP language, which I assume we will be, it'd be great if Tanel would be able to join again.
I definitely agree.
Yeah, she's stuck with us now, so
Okay.
not a problem.
Anything else for the good of the order? Fastest rules task force ever in the history of man. I cannot believe this.
Yeah.
You guys can have lunch today.
Oh, that's true.
Well, thank you, guys. We'll
All
get
right.
Mhm.
Well, thanks all. Talk to you in December.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank
Bye, guys.
you.
Bye.